Hey everybody, welcome back. If you haven't followed us on social media, do that. We are at MercyCast Pod on everything. If you want to send me an email and tell me what's going on or how you've enjoyed our podcast or some different topics that you'd like to hear about, info@mercycast.com. With that said, let's dive in. Welcome to the MercyCast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I am still Raleigh Sadler, your host. And, sometimes things in life, they hit different. Cody started at Prison Fellowship to help people. And as a new father, he discovered that certain things were hitting too close to home. Cody Wilde is the Senior Vice President of Correctional Programs at Prison Fellowship. He oversees the ministry's correctional programming in approximately 1,200 prisons across all 50 states. Cody, welcome to the MercyCast.
Hey, great to be with you, Raleigh.
So tell me, what was happening as you are a new dad and you're engaging this new role? What was going on? What were you experiencing?
Yeah, thanks, Raleigh. Just to back up a little bit. So I've been with Prison Fellowship for about a decade now. And before that, had served in the military, had been a pastor of a church in an impoverished sort of high crime area in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so it had some, ministry background of being in certain roles and in the quote unquote broken places. And so that was what initially intrigued me about prison. And so went in with sort of the same mindset, same role, sort of same responsibility of going in and seeing myself, honestly, and I don't think I would have said it this way at the time, but doing things to people, ministering to. And when I started at Prison Fellowship, my wife was about 3 months pregnant with our first child. And, anybody that's a parent knows that there's this expansion of your heart that occurs, when you become a father or mother. And you start to discover things inside of you that you didn't know were there. And I remember being in prison, working full-time in a correctional facility in north side of Minneapolis. And one of the things that we try to do a lot in Prison Fellowship is tell stories, have people talk about their experiences and their lives. And I was able to minister with and to people that had murdered or had burglarized somebody, robbed a bank, or, all of those things. But because it felt so other, it's like I was stepping into this completely other place. And then I remember my daughter was probably 3 or 4 months old. And I remember sitting in this classroom, listening to a number of guys tell their stories. And a few of them were in prison for crimes committed against children. And I just remember being totally unprepared for that. That it was like in this moment, the world felt so unsafe and I felt so vulnerable. And that all I wanted to do was to go home and to just protect my family, to protect my daughter. And it started to honestly take a toll on me. Because it wasn't just like I hear this story and then move on. It's like I hear this story and then I see the person who told the story every single day. And so it's sort of this compounding effect over time of, feeling those feelings. And, prison is full of all kinds of tragic stories. It's one place that at least the starting point began with something terrible that happened. And when you start feeling that and that people's stories are intersecting with yours and you're not prepared for it, it starts to almost feel like this avalanche on top of you. And this place that maybe I had idealized in the past, all of a sudden felt like it was starting to consume me. And I didn't know what to do.
Oh, wow. Wow. And yeah, you're telling me this. And I love how you said, I felt called to minister to people. And I think for a lot of us, there's that drive. We have done things in our past and we've gotten used to ministering a certain way. But when you deal with vulnerable populations like you are, some people don't see prison ministry as ministering to vulnerable populations, but they very much are. And as you are ministering to these people, if you go in it with this perspective of, I just want to minister to people, we can often be blindsided, like it sounds like you were. Like, why do you think it's so easy for us to focus on ministering to people? And could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. I think that we, especially when you go into vocational ministry, and that's like you have a title that goes with that. You know,
Right.
When you have a title, you can wear a uniform and have a mask and you're playing a role. And so with that, it keeps everything at sort of arm's distance. There's this clear differentiation. And I think that one of the implicit pieces of that is, again, whether we say it or not, we're probably not inclined to say it, but we go in as the hero and we go to a place to save somebody. And that's the assumed sort of storyline. And when things don't turn out that way and you find yourself as your kryptonite, if you will, when there's something that's happening to you and all of a sudden you don't feel strong anymore and those lines begin to blur, or in later times when I felt totally beat down and it was the word of a man behind bars to speak life into me, you know, and that the Lord was speaking through somebody that I thought I was doing something to, but in fact, it was the other way around. And ministry becomes sort of asymmetric. And those lines really start to blur, and you find that you're always just doing things with people, and it's messy.
Yeah, caring for others and caring for vulnerable neighbors will always expose our hidden Messiah complexes, wouldn't they? Like, I love how you said we come in as the hero. And I think that helps me as you define what it means to minister to people, because at that point it becomes like, I'm up here, they're down here, I'm giving of myself. But you gave such a good picture of how someone behind bars, someone on the other side, can actually minister to you. And I think when you do this kind of ministry, you realize that, yes, you may be serving vulnerable people, but it's also exposing your vulnerability.
Absolutely. One of my favorite books of the Bible is the Gospel of Luke. And prison has helped me like rethink kind of my posture toward the Bible as a whole, but I think in that book in particular. And I'd always sort of read that as, you know, because the Gospel of Luke, I think, highlights Jesus going to sort of marginal places, broken places, probably more than any of the others. And as Christians, you want to emulate Jesus, and it's like, okay, I'm going to go to those broken places. But through, I think, seeing what God has already been doing inside of broken places, inside of a place like prison, is that now when I read the Gospel of Luke, it's not as though Jesus was going to these forsaken places. It's that those were the places that God in his eternal wisdom chose to entrust the mysteries of the universe. It's like this thing that the prophets were like longing to look into. It's like God chose to reveal those to these people on the margins, to shepherds, to prostitutes, to the poor, to the blind. That's who God chose to reveal those things to. And so when we think that wisdom exists in the other places and we go there to bring it, I think in the counterintuitive nature of the kingdom of God, so it always turns the world on its head. It's like the arrow actually goes the other way. And that was probably one of the greatest gifts that I've gotten from my brothers and sisters behind bars.
Yeah, it's in the broken places. It's in the mundane places. So many times we're looking for the mountaintop, but the whole reason the mountaintop exists is so you can look into the valley where the day-to-day normal things, the base things happen. And I think I love how you brought up the Gospel of Luke, because some have called this a social justice gospel, some a biblical justice gospel, whatever terminology you're comfortable with. But at the end of the day, you see Jesus addressing the realities of life. And in that, there are so many things that are broken. And it's not the people who are pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps that are meeting Jesus. It's the people who are knee deep in their own mess. And I love how you're saying as you're going into this ministry, that's a messy ministry. Your own stuff is coming out. And you're realizing, like, we like to keep people at an arm's length. I loved how you used that imagery because we want to help people as long as we can protect ourselves. And that doesn't mean we don't do it with boundaries. I'm not saying that before anyone sends me an email or tries to at me. No, I'm all for boundaries. They are great. And they need to be instilled. There's wisdom in that. But I think so many times we go with walls. And walls and boundaries are not the same thing. And so as you're doing this and as it's exposing these things as a new father, what were your next steps? What did that look like as you were trying to navigate what felt like a new world?
Yeah. I think that like the initial reaction of any person when you're experiencing something that you're not expecting is, how do I get out of this as quickly as possible?
Yeah.
Like something's wrong. I need to retreat, or but whatever this is, it shouldn't be. So therefore something bad is happening. And I think that my perspective has shifted in that I think the Lord in all the time is inviting us into something. There's always an invitation. And I came to this place of the Lord just really saying, I want to do something in you right now, Cody. Don't just assume that what I'm trying to do is something through you. It's like, I want to do something in you. And then we'll use that. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be this process, and it's still going. But I want to do something in you first. And from that, you're going to minister from that place. That your ministry is going to overflow from these things that I'm doing in you. And I'm reading a book once, and I think it was a book by Paul Tripp, and he said that nobody preaches the gospel to you more than you. So what gospel you're preaching, it kind of matters. And so it's like, okay, this is an invitation for me to believe the gospel. It's to really believe it like I believe in gravity. Not just something that I assent to, but it actually like impacts me dispositionally and how I move through the world. And so what I just found is like the Lord is inviting me to do something with him. He's going to do something in me, and it's not going to be in comfortable places. And the other thing I'll just say with this is that, like going into a weight room, if there's no resistance, there's no growth. And so I've sort of changed my perspective on resistance and difficulty, that it's not something to avoid, but actually something to move into, and that the Lord is wanting to do that with us. And just really a belief that if I'm beginning my day with wanting to discern what the Lord is doing around me, he's not going to lay anything on me that he's not going to do with me. There's Matthew 11, the famous, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, I'll give you rest. I love the Message translation of it, where he talks about, walk with me, work with me. I won't lay anything heavy on you or ill-fitting, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. And so it's like, that's the invitation that the Lord is inviting us into, that it's a rest in, not a rest from, and that he doesn't promise us the avoidance of those difficult places. And so I just say I'm on a journey, sort of integrating those things, and have been, and have learned to really trust in Jesus and in his goodness and in his activity in my life.
I love how you describe this invitation as a rest in, not a rest from, because the entire time you were talking, I'm thinking to myself, I want to ask about what does it look like to recognize the invitation? And you really paint a great picture there. It's resting in Christ in the middle of the resistance, instead of seeing something that's uncomfortable as, well, this is a sign that I need to leave. No, it may not. It may actually turn out to be a sign you need to leave, but it's definitely a sign that you need to truly believe the thing that you say you believe as a Christian, that Jesus lived, he died, he rose for you. I think when we include vulnerable people into our daily spheres, it's going to shake things up. You're not going to be able to hide from reality. You're not going to be able to hide from the things that frustrate you. When you keep people at arm's length, that's easy. But now it's going to require that you really believe the gospel. So what's the difference between this mental assent that most of us have, and this down and dirty, I have to believe the gospel to make it through the day.
When I was still in the Army, I had a chaplain friend of mine who he described the invitation as speaking the resurrection into broken places and broken situations. And so it's not sugarcoating the difficult places. It's actually moving and feeling those things more deeply and holding out hope at the same time. Like this idea of Christ's resurrection is the first fruits of what all of creation is going to experience. It's a belief in that. Things will not always be this way. The Lord is going to put the world back together, is going to make everything right. And because of that, I can actually move more deeply into the brokenness of the world because it doesn't get the final say. And I think in the absence of that sort of cosmic hope, that big resurrection, we'll be crushed by the brokenness of the world. Like it's too much. And so what the gospel invites us into is this paradox of saying both things at the same time. Things are terrible. Like things are broken, things are difficult and painful, and don't minimize it at all. And it doesn't get the final say. And so I think that's when we think about gospel, it's not just the entry point into the faith. It is the faith. It is this hope. It is this promise that is accomplished both on Calvary and on Easter Sunday.
And I love that you explained that, because for so many of us, the gospel is like the starting blocks, but in reality, it's the whole race. It's the air we breathe. It's the track we run. It's what we are ultimately dependent on. And I love how your friend said, we need to speak the resurrection to those broken places, because that's the beauty of the gospel. I think the gospel has always gone to those most broken. As one of my former guests, Bradley Gray, said, the gospel flows downhill to the most broken places. And I think believing that, it assures us, it helps us, because where naturally we'd want to avoid the tough places, we know that we can go there now because God goes with us. And there is hope that this isn't how it's always going to be.
Amen.
How do you keep that idea in your mind? How do you keep believing that when it feels like just one thing after the other hits you and you're like, man, but this is really broken, God. This is really tough.
Yeah. I think it was the Apostle Peter who responded to Jesus with, where else would we go? Like, what's the alternative? The gospel, like, if it's true, if Jesus really did rise from the dead, that it doesn't matter how I'm feeling at a particular moment. It's that it's true, and that what's the alternative? And so where else would I go? And I don't have a choice other than to move forward. And that's not like this heroic thing. It's actually I think a recognition of my utter inadequacy and dependence. It's like, I know what it's like to not be carried, and I don't like it. And so nowhere else is safer than the suffering that comes with the gospel. And that's this like crazy paradox that God invites us into. So, yeah.
Well, I like how you talk about just the brutal reality of it, because oftentimes when we're seeking comfort, we're also pushing reality away. We don't want to face it. We just want to feel good. And that's not to minimize anything. Sometimes things are so rough that we do need to take a couple of steps back and care for ourselves. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I think, honestly, we sacrifice a lot at the altar of comfort. And what you're saying is, this is just the reality. And this is the truest thing about our world, is that Jesus came, he lived, and he died, and he rose. And this changes everything. And so it sounds like as you started doing this work, you realized that things couldn't be kept in their nice, neat little boxes, that things were kind of overflowing, that it was getting a little messy. What was it like to kind of wrestle with your own mess that was exposed as you were doing this work?
The founder of Prison Fellowship, Chuck Colson, one of his favorite writers was this Russian guy, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And Solzhenitsyn was one of his like famous one lines is that the line between good and evil runs right down the center of every human heart. And I think that we're used to, and especially in a very polarized world today, of wanting to put people into categories of these are the good people, these are the bad people. And, depending on who you are, like those lines shift a bit. But what I think prison has done for me is through proximity there over time, it becomes a mirror to my own heart. Like that's what it's done. And it's revealed certain things in me that I don't want to be overly or underly dramatic about, what it's revealed. Because one of the common things people will say is the only difference between this person, prison, and me is they got caught. It's like, well, I don't think that's unless you've killed somebody and haven't been arrested yet, like, is that really what you mean? Like, so on the one hand, it's like, yes, we all have stuff in our life, but those things have varying consequences and come with different baggage. And so I think that I don't want to minimize my own mess or minimize, what other people have been through. But I think the gospel is it's bigger than both of those things and allows us to just be honest about where we are. And I'll tell you this too. Prison, one of the tremendous graces of prison is it's truly a place that you can't hide. You can't hide for long because everybody in there, they notice everything and can pick out insincerity like that just very, very quickly. And so you can't go in and day out and be fake or be, phony or try to put on a front. You'll have zero credibility and people just know it. And so it's like, okay, well, I'm just giving into that then. So I'm just going to be where I am and I need to be on a journey and not think that I'm fixed or all better. And so what I would say to my team is your relationship with Jesus, your deepening union with Christ is of operational significance for everything that you do here. You don't check that at the door and just say, I'm going to get by on my talent or personality or experience.
Yeah.
That it is of operational significance that the Lord is flowing out of you.
Yes, absolutely. Resting in who we are actually matters. Resting in who God is for us actually matters because we can't necessarily do this without it. You were talking about freedom, which I find to be such a fascinating juxtaposition when you're talking about prison ministry. But you say that there's a freedom in not being able to hide. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I think that what one of the core things of people generally is this need for self-preservation. Like, I just think that's true. It's a true need. But I think the question is, what is it that we're trying to preserve? And not assuming that what we're trying to preserve is good. One of the stories in the Bible that I've been in dialogue with for the last decade is, the story of Adam and Eve. But in particular, the nature of the tree that they were being tempted with. Often we tell that story of that original sin as disobeying God. God said, don't do this. And it's the allure of the forbidden fruit. That's why we use that term. But I think that there was something more nefarious going on there, because up until that time, if Adam wanted to know what was good or right or true, he looked to God for it. It was that moment by moment dependence. And the temptation that the serpent placed in front of them was to be able to know those things independent of God. And so it wasn't just an act of disobedience. It was one of high treason of wanting to put themselves in the place of God. And I think that sin is sort of this perpetuation of this need to be gods, to be saviors, to be these things. And I think that at core, we're trying to preserve that. And so this sort of goes full circle back to how we started this, which it's with the understanding I'm going in to do ministry. I think I was still trying to preserve that God complex. And I think that there's good biblical reasons as to why I was trying to do that. And going into prison, and recognizing that everybody sees through that because I'm close. They see through that and I can't hide that. I've got one of two options: leave or address it. And so there's a freedom when everybody is, has a shared understanding of let's address it together and be on this journey, and not assume that anybody here, regardless of what you're wearing, has it all together.
Because in a very real way, you're crucifying your Messiah complex just right there. When you said that you got to know, you got to be self-aware of the very thing that you're trying to preserve, and then ask yourself that question, is it good? And then you ground it in the garden. And you're saying it was in the Garden of Eden that this desire, in a sense, to be God, this treasonous desire that says we know better, when you realize that is the thing that is being upset when you are encountering things that are outside of your control. Wow, that's got to be humbling. And honestly, I'm sitting with this idea because, yes, sometimes when I'm uncomfortable, it's because the thing that I'm facing is taking my own self-salvation, my own functional saviors to task. It's showing me that I can't fix my own problems. I can't fix myself. And that's awful. I don't like that feeling. I want to feel adequate to meet my needs. And there are moments in my life that I can't do it. And I so often see that as a negative without seeing the positive of this drives me to the very place I need to be anyway. So it's actually a gift. Are there some ways that you could help us recognize that gift? Because we sacrifice so much at the altar of comfort. And so how do we come back to seeing this adversity as a positive thing?
Everybody wants resurrection, but they don't want to die. We want what's on the other side of it, but to be raised from the dead means you got to die first. And
that's right.
So I think that's the invitation, is the Lord is calling us to carry your cross. You die, and through union with me, you're resurrected, and is doing this in and through us. And I think that that's the process of sanctification, is putting other things to death so that they may be renewed and restored and you become more. So I think that's the invitation. And again, I don't like the alternative. So, yeah.
No, and I think that is incredible. Yes, to experience resurrection, we die. And we're following a cruciform Savior, someone who died for us. And why would we expect anything else? And I think the thing about being in a world broken by sin is, regardless of whether you follow Jesus or not, you will face tough times. Life will be hard. But as we follow Jesus, we have that person that we can depend on, even when things don't make sense and life is unbelievably messy. And yeah, I think it's so good, because knowing the fact that the reason that I may be upset is because I am living with this idea that is not exactly biblical. Or maybe it's biblical, but it's biblical in the wrong way. It's in the Bible, but it's talking about our sin. And I think dealing with populations that are broken, it's going to reveal our sin.
Yeah.
Have you seen that more in this ministry than other ministries that you've done?
Yeah, because I think that in the other areas of ministry, military and in church, to be quite frank, the level of proximity, it's easy to stage. So as a pastor, most people would have an hour and a half of me a week. And I would have that, and it'd be, I'm up front. So like the level of mess that you can avoid, it's much greater. So in prison, our staff, they go in on a daily basis and work full time in prisons, and we have other roles as well. But for me, it was just that day in and day out proximity and recognizing I can't hide that really forced the question. Like I said, the only other alternative was to just leave. but if I'm going to be here, I gotta be here. And one of those really famous Bible passages about prison, it's the Hebrews 13:3. Remember those in prison as though you yourself are in prison. But sometimes we forget that there's something that comes after that and some stuff that comes before that. And I've really come to view Hebrews 13:1-3 as this journey. Hebrews 13:1, it's about loving one another, sort of the communion of believers. Verse 2 goes into entertaining the stranger, welcoming the stranger, or the entertaining angels unbeknownst to you. And then verse 3, it's remember those in prison as though you yourself are in prison, and those who are being mistreated as though being mistreated with them. And it seems like there's this expansion of the gospel implications that, yes, you should be loving one another, and you should be a little bit more uncomfortable by, are you welcoming those who are different, the stranger, which can mean a few different things throughout the Bible. But then it goes into those who are in prison and those who are being mistreated. And I don't know that the author is being like redundant there and just saying the same thing in two different ways. What I've actually come to believe is that the author of Hebrews in verse 3 is actually contrasting two people groups. Those who are in prison, perhaps because they deserve to be, and those who have been mistreated, who haven't deserved that. And so it's saying to both the victim and the victimizer, the oppressed and the oppressor, that the gospel is really that big. And so it seems like it's this story arc of the expansiveness of the gospel, that it interacts our relationships with one another. It makes us uncomfortable by bringing in people who are different from us, and actually says to both the guilty and to the innocent, the blood of Christ is actually that big and it does go that far. And so what that's forced me to do is I go to a church where we take communion every Sunday. And for those individuals that I've encountered in prison that maybe hit very close to home, that I feel angry at, to be quite honest, surprisingly angry at. And I take those elements and I hear the words, the blood of Christ shed for you, and the you is that person. And I imagine that I said, the blood of Christ shed for you and therefore shed for me. Mm-hmm. And it's, do I really believe that? And I think that just by, reenacting the Lord's Supper, it's that being confronted with that very core gospel message of, do I really believe this? Do I believe this in my bones? And do I believe this like gravity? Or do I just believe it as though it's somewhere out there that I ascend to? And the last thing I'll just say on this, Raleigh, is going back to this Hebrews 13:3 passage, begins with the word remember. And this word has become so important to my journey at Prison Fellowship and just in ministry generally. To remember in the Bible is not just to recall. It's not just to assent to, but it's to hold the presence of a thing before you, to make it real to all of your senses. And it makes so much more sense of the Old Testament. One of those common refrains is, remember, I'm the Lord your God who led you out of the land of Egypt. The people would put together these monuments to remember this thing that God did in their time and space. And so it's to like make those things real to them and to feel the full weight of that. And when you apply that to this sort of story arc of Hebrews 13:1-3, hold the presence of the guilty and the oppressed, the victim and the victimizer before you, the stranger and the brother, and to say the blood of Christ shed for you and therefore shed for me. It steps on toes, and if the gospel isn't stepping on toes, it may not be the gospel.
Well, it absolutely steps on toes, because it challenges not only our view of other people, but our view of ourselves. We never want to see ourselves as the bad guy, because oftentimes we like to think in these black and white categories that you're either good or bad. That's not how this works. And you even pointed to that as you were telling about Chuck Colson earlier, that we all have our own shades that we bring to the party. And I love how you said one of the ways to kind of understand that is through proximity, because if we keep people at that arm's length, we're never going to let them in or get to know them. And one thing that, as I train a church or as I train university students on how to love their most vulnerable neighbors, I'll always bring up this example of working in a soup kitchen. I said there's always two different types of people. They're the people that have come there for their holiday and they're going to give out turkey and it's going to be this great moment, but they're going to stand behind the line. Now, there's other people and they cross the line. They go and they sit with the people and they talk to them and they actually get to know them and they look in their eyes and they hear their stories. And then they're challenged by the people and the people are challenged by them. And this holy moment takes place. And I always like to ask the person who crosses the line, and this is what I'll tell the students. I say, I like to ask them why you did that. And what they typically do is they'll say, well, there was a time in my life where we were down and out. We were struggling. My family didn't have enough. And we had to go to someone for help. And I could see myself in those people. And I can't sit back there. I need to go and be with these people because these are people that God has put on this earth. They are made in the image of God. And so they see themselves in those most vulnerable. But for a lot of us, we can't see ourselves in those who are imprisoned. How do we change that? Because you're coming at it from a compassionate viewpoint. And so how do we right what we may have unintentionally wronged in our own view of them?
Yeah, I think that proximity is the biggest, I think, variable in that, and that there are multiple ways to become proximate. At Prison Fellowship, we have our in-prison offerings. Volunteers or staff go in on a daily or weekly basis and get to have that sort of life-on-life interaction. When we do that all over the country, but actually our largest program, it's a program called Angel Tree, where we work with churches in all 50 states that get to purchase a Christmas present on behalf of the incarcerated parent for their child and deliver it to that child at Christmas time with a note from mom or dad. So the parent in prison actually signs up for this. And then the idea is that that church comes alongside that child and their caregiver in a year-round ministry. And what makes that program different from others that are maybe out there is we connect local families and local churches. So it's not doing ministry to some people somewhere. It's most likely in your own zip code that you don't know are there. And so there's proximity to the children, and that's somebody's child, and that child loves their mom or dad. And so when you begin to love somebody, you start asking, what is it that person loves? And so as an extension, I now love what they love, which is their parent. Regardless of their imperfection, it's still somebody's mom or dad, and it can set you on this journey. And one of my favorite quotes is, the best journeys answer questions that at the beginning you didn't know to ask. And so I would just say, get proximate. We've got a number of different resources to just begin that journey, and then to really discern, like, where is the Lord leading you and how do you join him in that work?
And that's so good, because when I work with a church, I will talk about potential vulnerable populations that could be in their community and how do we love our neighbor who's in our path. And one of the things that people never really seem to think about is that oftentimes those who have been incarcerated, as well as their families, can be very vulnerable to exploitation. And like we had talked about earlier, we like to think in terms of black and white, and it doesn't always work out that way. And exploiters seem to like the fact that we don't see that because they can focus on that. And so, yeah, I love how your ministry focuses on people who are in your community, because it brings it home, doesn't it? Like when we realize that it's not just over there, and we realize that no, it's in our backyard. There are vulnerable people who've been impacted by incarceration all around us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a much more pervasive thing than I think people realize. And something around 1 in 3 Americans, have some sort of a criminal record. And so this impacts more people sitting in the pews than anybody would like to talk about. So it's already there. You don't have to go looking for it. You just need to be a place that it can actually be told, a place that you can actually bring your own brokenness in a safe place.
And I think as we face the brokenness around us, it almost invites us to face our own brokenness and to bring that to the cross, to bring that to Jesus, to almost see it as an invitation of like, oh, I'm seeing my own stuff. As I'm caring for these people, this stuff's welling up in me. And so it's like we get this opportunity to say, God, meet me here. I invite you into this because I don't know what to do. I don't know how to process this. I'm realizing I'm having anger towards this person, or I'm scared and I want to run. I think that there's a beauty in saying, God, I want to invite you into this right now. Be with me in it. Help guide me through this.
Yeah.
How would you encourage those of us who we want to do something, but we don't know where to start?
Well, I'll give a plug for Prison Fellowship. So I'd visit prisonfellowship.org, and that there's a number of different routes to get involved, depending upon a person's, availability and passion area. Like I said, all 50 states have prisons. There are jails in virtually every county in America. You're already proximate to people behind bars. And so, but oftentimes a prison can exist in a neighborhood and nobody knows about it. It's invisible. It's a forsaken place. But what we want to do is to be able to highlight the sacredness that's held in those forsaken places, and that God has not forsaken it. When Jesus yells out on the cross in like terror, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then says, it is finished. Like, I think he actually meant that. And so that there are no more forsaken places, that God is alive and well in prison, and he's inviting us to experience him with our brothers and sisters behind bars. And this has really become Prison Fellowship's mission, which is to encounter Jesus with those impacted by incarceration, not bringing Jesus to there. He's already there. And so let's do this thing together.
Yes, that's so good. How would you encourage those of us who are learning that loving our neighbor is just a little bit more messy than we thought it was at the beginning?
Yeah, it's messy because we're messy, and we're coming to learn that about ourselves. And so we may not like that. And I would just say, for listeners that are in some type of ministry, they're doing something in some capacity, that we need to think of ministry as spiritual formation. Because oftentimes we think about our devotional lives or spiritual formation as like a gas station. I go and get filled up, and then I leave and I go and do the thing. And so I depart from that. And it's like, no. Moment by moment, the Lord is inviting us into something because he wants us, not because he needs us. And so ministry is something that's doing something to us every single second of every single day. And the last thing I'll say on this is, because I've seen this far too many times, far too many people in ministry have disqualified themselves from ministry in the name of ministry. They've created it into an idol. It's because they've removed themselves from the source, and it becomes about the activity. Ministry is the overflow of the heart and the home. When we look at the qualifications for ministry leadership that Paul lays out in, say, like 1 Timothy and Titus, he spends an inordinate amount of time talking about the maturity of one's faith, the sincerity of their character, the quality of their relationships, beginning at home. And it's then and only then are we talking about things like gifting, calling, and doctrine. And we try to separate those things. It's like, no. Those overflow into the work that we do. And so we need to spend far more time at the source, and then just be responsive to the invitation that the Lord is providing to us, because he's going to do something. But we are not God, but thank God for that.
That's the perfect note to end on. Go back to the source. Go back to the thing that drives you. And so, Cody, thank you so much for being on today. This has been great.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ali. Thank you so much.